of the survey, the interest level? And yes, there is the obligatory notice that we are being recorded. So you have all that. If everybody could hit the got it, we can proceed. And we'll leave those results there. And there will be another survey at the end, basically a link to gauge your interest and if you want to follow up. So good evening, everybody. My name is Brad Wolf. I'm with Peace Action Network of Lancaster. And we are here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. This event's being sponsored by two groups tonight, 1040 for Peace of Lancaster and Peace Action Network of Lancaster. And these two groups are from the Lancaster community, all promoting. And we gathered tonight, September 21st, on this International Day of Peace. We gather as a community, all of us believing that peace is possible. It's not just an ideal, but we're working for peace in our own way every day. And one of the ways we're doing that is by holding forums like this, educational forums where we can learn, we can ask questions, and then we can go forth and spread the word about what we've learned here. Because as we will discuss tonight, there is a culture in place that we need to change, and we can change it through education. To help us honor this day, this International Day of Peace, we have with us Dr. Kelly Denton-Borhaug, who's joined us to discuss her research on moral injury and U.S. war culture, which is an important and timely and devastating subject. We have about an hour with Kelly, and we're going to be taking questions from the chat box. So please go ahead, feel free to type in the questions as we're talking. And I mentioned the survey. And I also want to let you know that we'll be having a follow-up discussion in October. If you are so interested, it will be October 13th at 7 p.m. It's going to be a virtual event, and it's just going to be an informal discussion among all of us. Kelly is teaching that night, will not be joining us, but this subject is too important and too valuable to let it go with one session. So we're going to continue it on October 13th at 7. The Zoom link will be posted on the Facebook page of 1040 for Peace. And so with that, I would like to introduce Kelly. Kelly has long been investigating how religion and violence collide in American war culture. She is a professor in the Global Religions Department at Moravian University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And she's the author of two books, U.S. War Culture and Sacrifice. U.S. War Culture, Sacrifice and Salvation. And more recently, And Then Your Soul is Gone, Moral Injury and U.S. War Culture. She also recently wrote an article entitled, Why Are So Many Military Brothers and Sisters Taking Their Own Lives? And that article was for Tom Dispatch. Kelly, welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. And I loved your book. I mean, I've read it, I've tabbed it, I've taken notes on it. It's such an important part of the literature of peace and nonviolence. And you know, as I read it, it was informative and insightful, but it was also so upsetting to see what is happening out there. And so I thought a good place to start might be just to have you talk to us about how you first became involved in this subject, and then give us a definition of what you mean by moral injury.
Great. Thank you, Brad. And thank you so much, everyone, for inviting me to be with you tonight. I can't think of a better way of marking this day, the International Day of Peace, than to gather with folks like you and to engage in some serious discussion and learning and reflection. So it's a great honor. So thank you so much. And by the way, this isn't the first time I've been with many of you. I have to flag John Stoner, who I see in the Zoom, for his efforts over quite a few years to bring me to Lancaster to talk about my first book and to do some education with his congregation. So I feel like I have a special connection with at least some of you, and that's really wonderful. All right. So how did I get into this? How did a nice person like me get into this kind of a terrible topic? Believe me, I ask myself that. I I've actually been working in this area since not long after 9/11. And now here we have just marked 20 years of the post 9/11 wars and the post 9/11 period. And that is just so incredibly sobering for me. But in the period of time just before 9/11, over 20 years ago, I had recently finished my dissertation. I'm a theological ethicist, and in my PhD work, I was focusing on issues of sacrifice and soteriology. Soteriology means the study of salvation in Christian theology. And I had been really immersed in the literature and the ideas of many thinkers and writers, especially who were raising critical questions about sacrifice, sacrificial metaphors, sacrificial doctrine, sacrificial logic, and what they saw as its devastating impact, especially on marginalized communities, not only in the United States, but around the world. So that was in my head and in my heart when the events of 9/11 happened. And as I'm sure many of you remember, the culture of the United States really shifted quite distinctively after those events in so many ways. But what I noticed about the culture was somewhat, I think, different perhaps from many others, in that my education, my training, the work that I had been doing had really sensitized me to this language of sacrifice. And all of a sudden I noticed that it was everywhere, on the lips of political, military leaders, in popular culture, on the lips of religious leaders. People were saying, we're going to war and this is a necessary sacrifice and there's no other choice. And I felt that that discourse as a kind of assault to my consciousness. And I knew I needed to start looking into what was going on. What was this association of sacrifice with war, and this language of necessity? And that's what really launched me on this investigation 20 years ago. And it resulted in my first book, which you mentioned, where I really explored the nature of these relationships, and also along the way found myself having to grapple with the reality of what I came to call U.S. war culture, the monolith of U.S. war culture. I did not begin this research really with, I knew that the United States was a big spender when it came to military spending, but I had really never found myself faced with or taken on the task of investigating this in any depth. And once I started investigating sacrificial language and its connection to war, that was a necessary step. And along the way, I developed my own definition of war culture, which I define as the ethos, institutions, and practices of war, which interpenetrate with an unending array of supposedly civilian sites in US culture, including sites such as the economy, education, commerce, religion, popular culture, youth culture, sports. The list just goes on and on. So that was what first launched me onto this path. And then about in 2011 or so, I was continuing to do this work. I found that even after I published the book, the need to continue to explore and work on all of this really did not go away. But in about 2011, I was invited to this remarkable conference that took place at Riverside Church in New York City. And it was a gathering to explore conscientious objectors of war within the military. So people within the branches of the US military who were trying to explore avenues for conscientious objection. And at that conference, we heard veterans of the post 9/11 wars, as well as war correspondents, give testimony to their experiences. And we also were privileged to hear the psychiatrist, the VA psychiatrist, Jonathan Shea, who about 2 years earlier had coined the terminology of moral injury. In about 2009, he started using that language. And the reason why he coined that terminology was because he had been working for decades with Vietnam veterans. And in his work with them, especially trying to help them find pathways of healing that could respond to the overwhelming resentment, guilt, shame they experienced in their post-service lives. He realized that the traditional pathological diagnoses in psychology really didn't work. Even PTSD really didn't work. PTSD and moral injury share a certain field of very similar symptoms, but the causal factors really are different. So whereas PTSD is a kind of trauma of war that has to do with especially fear and hyper anxiety, hypervigilance, moral injury really has to do with moral pain and moral dissonance. And maybe at this point, it would be helpful for me to give a few definitions for what moral injury is. So one of the early psychological researchers defined moral injury as taking place when someone perpetrates, fails to prevent, or bears witness to acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. So moral injury really has to do with the struggle of being betrayed and participating in betrayal. It has to do with the sense that one has betrayed one's own deepest values. But it also has to do with the sense that one has been betrayed or transgressed by others as well, in terms of those really deep core values. And this has to do with acts that people commit, but it also has to do with the sheer witnessing of the brutal and the devastating reality of war and what that does to people. So that was kind of an early definition. But I'd like to share just a few other definitions with all of you as well. My colleague Chris Antal in his work came to define moral injury as the collision between a person's reflective conscience and the brutally harsh realities of war and killing. So that's kind of a helpful step forward, I think, from the earlier definition in terms of really getting to this important nub of the matter, this dissonance, this conflict between one's moral conscience and the brutal reality of war and killing. But then in my work, I took that a step further. And I call moral injury the inevitable consequence of participation in the moral distortion of the world that is created by war. So because in my work, what I'm trying to do is more of a systemic analysis, I want to talk about the fact that war distorts the world. It distorts the very world and in essence makes it inhabitable for human beings. So that's my definition. And maybe just two other little sort of brief footnotes. I really appreciate Michael Yandel's definition. Michael Yandel is an Iraq war veteran and I think he's a UCC minister, if I'm not mistaken, but don't hold me to that in terms of his denomination. But he has defined moral injury as despair of the world and of myself. And I just find that so powerful, despair of the world and of myself. And then lastly, the moral injury group at the Philly VA also talks about moral injury as the consequence of the unbalanced distribution of moral pain. So if war and war culture produce moral pain, moral injury, at least in part, surfaces because that pain is not being shared fairly, justly. It's been deposited on the backs of far too few people, while the vast majority aren't carrying that pain at all, but in fact are even in denial of it. So maybe I'll stop there, Brad.
Thank you, Kelly. Yes. One of the things in your book that you do so well is you humanize the idea of moral injury by talking about individuals you've met, veterans and things like that. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit, for those who haven't read the book, tell us a little bit about Andy from Iraq, his experiences in war, and sort of the long road to recovery that he's gone through working with Chris Antel down in Philly.
Sure. I first heard Andy testify about his experiences at a Philadelphia church a number of years ago, maybe now about 4 years ago. Andy went through the moral injury group. He was referred to the moral injury group that had fairly recently been started by Chris Antal and Peter Yeomans. Part of the moral injury group involves participants gathering with people who have indicated, civilians as well as service members and others, people who have indicated willingness to listen to them and to take all of this seriously and to consider what it would mean to carry their brunt of the burden. So in that moral injury group, veterans who participate are encouraged to develop testimony that will respond to two questions. What do you need to unburden yourself of? And what do people need to hear? And so Andy not only had testified as a part of his process within the group, but after he graduated, he was testifying in more and more places. And he and the leaders of the group, as well as others, really referred to that as being a prophet. He was doing prophetic work. So I first heard Andy at this Philadelphia church, and that was relatively, I still had a lot to learn about moral injury. I still do, but then I even had more to learn. Andy was part of the Air Force. He was raised in a very proud military family. Both his father and grandfather had served in branches of the U.S. military. He enlisted as volunteered as a very young man. And eventually he deployed. He worked in intelligence for the Air Force. And the kind of critical incident that he testified about that night was an event that took place when he was deployed in Iraq that involved him calling in an airstrike on a supposed target. And a missile was fired and it blew up a building. And then Andy and others were ordered to go into the building after that and find the target of the airstrike. But when they went into the building, what Andy found was a pile of 36 bodies of men, women, and children. And he had to sift through the bodies to try to find the supposed target. The way he characterized that was by saying that the sights and smells and sounds of that time in that bombed out structure, sorting through those bodies, was etched on the back of his eyelids forever. I'll never forget him saying that. And his hands were fluttering in front of his face when he uttered those words. It was unforgettable. And at that point, Andy began to really sort of, cycle down into a pretty dark place. Eventually, he became suicidal. He finished his service. He came back to the United States, and he was really a mess. He was referred from one psychiatric program service to the next within the VA over 8 years, and nothing helped. And when finally he was referred to this moral injury group, he told us that he had said to himself, this is the last thing I'm going to try. And if this doesn't help, I'm going to kill myself. So I still am amazed at his inner strength to somehow endure that pain and keep going over all those years, and not give up, because as we know, so many people do find it unendurable and they do give up. 4 times as many veterans in the post 9/11 period are committing suicide as dying in battlefield operations. 4 times as many. And one really troubling statistic involves younger veterans aged 18 to 36 who are committing suicide. Those numbers have increased by 76% since 2005. Those are statistics from the Costs of War research project at Brown University. That's a really fine group. So Andy very easily could have been part of that statistic. But the moral injury group at the Philadelphia VA, led by this chaplain and this psychologist, they had a different approach. Their approach was to tell the veterans that they had an important story to tell and the nation needed to hear it. And in addition to many other things that they learn and are exposed to over like a 12-week program, they prepare to take part in this public ceremony and offer testimony. And the ceremony is created to not only to provide a platform for them, but also to really challenge the people who come, civilians like me, to think really hard and long about our culpability, our complicity, what we need to do to carry our brunt of this burden. So that was really a turning point in Andy's life. And since then, he's become involved in a moral injury leadership group of veterans, working with a small group of others. And what they have dedicated themselves to is really just, I find, amazingly wonderful. They are engaged in acts of restitution and recompense. They are involved in what he calls acts of piety, working with especially people in faith communities and other communities to try to come together and be active around these issues. And the third element is maybe the most, I think, fascinating to me. They commit themselves to challenging the military industrial complex of the United States. So this was before, if even now, Andy has any awareness of my work, but I found it really just telling and fascinating that coming out of this experience and forging a new path, part of the realization for Andy and others is that we can't address moral injury without addressing U.S. war culture. And that's really my conviction as well. So Andy is doing better now. I mean, I don't believe, and I don't know Andy personally. I have been in public gatherings with him now on a number of occasions, but I don't know him personally. But Chaplain Antal tells me that Andy is actually, you know, he is forging a new path and he's surviving.
Thank you. And stories like Andy's don't exist in a vacuum. As you said, they exist in this war culture that we have here. And you use the term interpenetration. Mm-hmm. And I can see that there's already a question about the role of faith and religion in war. And that's a part of sort of this structural systemic violence that we have. We use things like religion to conceal or cover the violence that we're asking people to engage in. Can you just talk a little bit about how America embodies the war culture and how it seeps into everything, our media, entertainment, sports, and how religion is sort of used as a cover for it?
Yeah, wow. I think one of the hardest elements of all of this really does have to do with the role of religion. So we definitely want to spend some time talking about that. And I brought an example with me that I can share with you and talk about it a little bit, just to help us sort of delve into some of the complexity. And, you know, I would really love to hear from all of you because I'm really interested in learning more about the ways in which your communities have forged pathways to resist some of these tendencies, especially regarding the colonization of religion in the service of war culture. So what in And Then Your Soul Is Gone. I continued to explore the interpenetration of the institution's ethos and practices of war with so many civilian sites, but simultaneously, I really needed to look more seriously at the reality of violence. I really needed to better understand what violence is and how it works. And I turned to a wonderful Norwegian sociologist and peace researcher by the name of Johan Galtung, who developed this marvelous tool called the violence triangle. So you have to imagine a triangle in your mind in order to think about what violence is and how it works. So at the top of the triangle is direct violence. These are the eruptions of violence that take place, like let's say the calling of the airstrike, or even Andy's, if a veteran commits suicide. Those are the eruptions of violence. And they're the most visible factor of violence and what we tend to focus on. But if we stop there with our analysis of violence, we're really missing the picture, according to Galtung, because as he explains, direct violence is always sourced by deeper layers of violence, and it really doesn't exist without those deeper layers. So the other two prongs of the triangle have to be brought into the analysis. And one of those is structural violence, and the other is cultural violence. So Brad, you were sort of referencing structural violence by talking about all of the different ways that the violence of war culture is embedded in our structures. Here's I mentioned this one in the book. I don't know how many of you live in neighborhoods with hometown hero banners on the utility poles. I have one of those that hangs right outside my door, my front door. And I see that as just a perfect example of both structural and cultural violence. Those were put up by my local township borough. Nobody asked me. I don't know that there was ever any sort of survey of the community, although maybe it would have passed and people would have gladly done it. But those banners valorize veteran service without ever addressing a much wider landscape of violence that needs to be also explored, much less their own stories. So all you see is the smiling face of the veteran with hometown hero and the pretty uniform and the years of their birth and death. But you have no idea what they actually experienced, and you absolutely have no idea of any of the victims of violence on the other end of what they were doing in whatever war they were a part of. So that's a good example of structural violence. Of course, another very obvious one would simply be to look at something like the United States Pentagon budget and the amount of money that is funneled every year, passed unthinkingly, it seems like, by Congress year after year into the discretionary budget of the United States. Over 60 cents of every dollar. And many scholars have estimated that it's actually much higher than that. According to the National Priorities Project, equivalent to the next 11 highest military spenders in the world combined. So there's another really good example of sort of structural violence. But because it's embedded in the structures and the systems of our reality, it's harder to see. And we often don't think about it. It's invisible to us. It's concealed from active awareness. And then cultural violence is the most difficult layer of violence to see of all, the third prong of the triangle. Because cultural violence is pre-reflective. It's the kind of violence that exists in any culture that is a part of its worldview, and we're born into it. We think it's as natural as fish think the water they swim in is a natural part of their environment. So, once again, going back to the hometown hero banners, nobody stops to ask if those banners communicate a message that is really lopsided and just wrong. And in fact, I have often found that when and if I raise objections to things like this, people get pretty upset with me. Because cultural violence, again, often is a part of people's very identity. And if you raise questions about it, you are challenging something that is very dear to them, even as it's simultaneously something that they probably haven't really ever thought very much about. So they tend to have an emotional reaction, and they can often respond in a kind of hostile way. So that's the triangle of violence. But would you like me to go ahead and just share with you another example that I brought with me?
Yes, please.
Okay. Am I able to share the screen? I'm going to try to. Oh, it looks like I am. Okay, so, whoops, let me get rid of that. Uh-oh. Are you seeing, let's see, I hope that what you're seeing is this. Are you seeing the image of the soldier against the wings?
Yes.
Greater love has no one
Okay.
than this.
Great, great, great. So I have this really perverse hobby of collecting things like this. By the way, let me just show you one other one. This isn't religious per se. Here, I'm going to make this big. This is one that I just found this week. It was on a car window. Take a look at that. Do you see what's going on there in this decal made of lethal weapons, spelling out love and with a peace symbol? I don't even really know what to make of this, but I see these kinds of random and thoughtless celebrations of violence all over the place. Let me get out of there. Okay, but back to this one, because here's where we see, religion come into play. So, notice the verse from John 15. This is a verse that is regularly hijacked for war culture in the United States. This is just one example, and I'll tell you another place where it was hijacked in just recent years. But so then you've got the angel wings with the American flag superimposed on them and the saluting soldier superimposed on that. And then, just in case we might miss it, notice that this has been commodified and you can purchase it. So now it's also a part of the kind of capitalist system of selling certain images, certain messages, certain assumptions and frameworks about war and religion to people. Let me just say a few more words about that, though, and I'm going to stop sharing because now that's probably sadly engraved in your mind, and you'll have nightmares about it tonight when you go to sleep. In the last presidential administration, I'll give you an example of the way this is hijacked by political leaders. In the last political administration, maybe some of you will remember that relatively early on, Mr. Trump ordered a military action in Yemen that resulted in the death of a Navy SEAL and the death of civilians and combatants from Yemen. I'm not remembering the number, but it was a significant number. It was somewhere in the teens to the 20s. And also the destruction of very expensive military equipment. And he immediately was on the receiving end of a lot of criticism in the country, including from the Navy SEAL, his name was Ryan Owens, his own father, who also was a military veteran, who began publicly criticizing Trump. So this wasn't good for Trump. And he gathered together with his advisors, and they planned for him to give a speech, the first speech it would be, to the joint houses of Congress, and to address this among other issues. On the day of the speech, they invited not Ryan Owens' father, but Ryan Owens' wife, his widow, to come as Mr. Trump's special guest and have a seat in the balcony. And at a pivotal moment in the speech, Mr. Trump turned to her and said something along the lines, I'm just going to paraphrase here. Ryan's memory is etched in eternity because, as the Bible teaches us, greater love has no one than this, than to lay down his life for his friends. Ryan laid down his life for his friends, and we will never forget him. And at that, the cameras pivoted to the widow. Her face was filled with emotion. Her eyes were filled with tears. She looked up to the heavens. People burst into a spontaneous standing ovation. And all of the criticism was just buried, just absolutely buried. And following that, in not only political, advisors of Trump, but media personalities, media leaders across the country began to refer to this very presidential thing that Trump did by giving this speech, and in particular, calling upon this framework for interpreting what had happened with Ryan Owens. So, but once again, I think this really flies under the radar for most people. I don't sense that many people, when this kind of stuff happens, they really even see it, although people tend to be very emotionally impacted by it. And once again, what I want people to see is that this influences the way that people think about war. It makes war into a kind of sacred activity. It sacralizes war. And as I've come to learn, once you sacralize anything, you remove it off of the screen of being addressed by critical thought and critical attention. People tend not to do that with things that are sacred. They are set aside as something to be held in awe, not something to be critically addressed or deconstructed. And so what Trump did was beautifully successful in terms of his goals. But I have to tell you, it's not just Trump, it's every single presidential administration in the post 9/11 era that's done this sort of thing. Really pretty shamelessly, both Democratic and Republican. And it really works. And so why wouldn't they do it? But this also tends to be, I think, sort of the dominant cultural approach, not only to the military, but to war. This sort of absorption, colonization, hijacking of various elements from Christianity in order to try to find some sort of meaning in the devastating losses of war. But in the process, war gets sacralized, and citizens seem to lose the capacity to call out its violence and to demand a greater accountability. And let me just say that these kinds of things are rife in Christian churches across the country, and especially at such times as Memorial Day or Veterans Day. You will find sermons, you will find liturgies, you will find hymnody that is filled with this kind of stuff. It's extremely, extremely common. And again, if you call it out, people often get really upset with you. They really don't like it, up to and including religious people. And this problem of this particular Bible verse being hijacked from war goes all the way back to Jesus's own time. So in that chapter from the Gospel of John, the bulk of the chapter is about abiding with Jesus and with his Father and with the disciples in love. That the verb abiding and remaining with Jesus just is repeated over and over again. And the dominant image for that is foot washing. So that is really the kind of primary thrust of that passage. However, this little insertion is really interesting to explore more deeply, because as it turns out, biblical scholars really wonder where it came from. And they note that while in Jesus's time, the idea of friendship, including giving one's life for somebody else, was a common idea in the Greek world, in the Roman world. This was not something that the Jewish rabbis felt so comfortable with, because for them, the only person or the only entity who has domain over life and death is God. And so it really isn't up to a human being to make that decision to give his or her life for somebody else. That's God's territory, not human territory. But by the same token, there were other Roman and and Hellenistic literary, poetic, and other influences that communicated this kind of idea. And even in that period, these ideas were utilized by political leaders of the Roman Empire for their own purposes, in just the same way that they're utilized today by US political leaders. So what I wish, and what I really am trying to call for, is especially people of faith to become much more sophisticated in terms of recognizing these kinds of dynamics and calling them out, and not simply buckling under them, but really, really naming them for what they are, which I would say is an abuse of Christianity, and even an abuse of citizenship, of understandings of what it means to be a nation. And I would like for them to call out sort of the naivete of American understandings and assumptions about violence that shape our war culture and promote its concealment from common vision, and really prevent people from taking greater action over against it.
Thank you. That's such an important aspect of all this for us to realize, because it's stunning how the nonviolent Messiah of Christianity can become a war icon. And we have to remember that our veterans volunteered for this position. They weren't drafted to go to war. They wanted to. And part of the reason, I think, is religion has led them to believe that this was a noble thing to do, and that somehow it was part of a religious nature or upbringing for all of them. And it's certainly a religious justification for them to do what they were asked to do. And then when they get there, they realize that's not the case. So that is really important for, particularly in this community where there are so many Christian churches, to recognize that. I wanted to try to talk a little bit about this idea where in your book you mentioned that moral injury is an atrocity. And if it is an atrocity, what does that mean for the whole justification of war and war fighting as we go forward?
Great. So let me just say one thing about your comment, Brad. You know, the more that I listen to the actual voices of veterans, the more that I am coming to understand that what has led them, or what their pathways into volunteering for military service are really complex. And you know, I think I'm all for really valuing people who have made that decision as people, and trying to listen to them as deeply as I can. And I really want to try not to oversimplify their lives, their choices, their self-understandings. And so, you know, I've really come to understand that for many people, that choice to enter into the military is really fraught with so many different pressures, teachings, ways that they have been formed in family and by culture, economic issues, the poverty draft that we all have heard about. And I often wonder, and here's where also I think particularly people in peace churches could really play a role. Where are the people who gave them counsel at that critical moment before they signed the papers to help them think about what in fact they were signing up for? My experience is that in the vast majority of circumstances, they didn't have those people. In fact, they had people who were just pretty gung-ho about war culture, or who were telling them, you're going to have great opportunities. I heard one of my students in my class say this just this week. His own father said to him, you should join the military after you graduate from high school because there are so many wonderful opportunities for you. And in the second week of our course, he said to us, after only 2 weeks of studying moral injury, all I can say is, I'm really glad I decided to go to college. I mean, that's tragic to me, you know? Why aren't there more adults in this country, thoughtful adults who understand the nature of war, who are reaching out to young people and trying to help them think this through thoughtfully? I get really, frankly, angry when I think about that, because I just find that there's way too big of a dearth in the lives of young people. They're seeing the ROTC recruiters in their shiny uniforms every week in the high school cafeteria. But where are the peace people who are showing up and setting up their table alongside the recruiters and saying, you know, there's another point of view here, and I really wish you would think about it. So, okay, enough. I'm getting off that little soapbox. Atrocity. So in the end, I think if we take moral injury seriously and its devastation, and not only in the lives of individual members of the military, but really in the country as a whole, I draw on the work of a philosopher by the name of Claudia Card, who has defined atrocity as foreseeable, intolerable harm produced by culpable wrongdoing. And I use that language to say, yes, if that's what an atrocity is, then moral injury is an atrocity. It's foreseeable when people know that it will happen to our military service members. It's intolerable. People are killing themselves. It's such a harm. But then this second phrase, produced by culpable wrongdoing, that's where then all of us have to really grapple with where we fit into the picture. Because, you know, I consider myself to be complicit in this. I'm a citizen of the United States. I have to share the responsibility for what's happening, right? And I have to do something about it. So that's a little bit about atrocity. I really want to make sure that we leave some time open, Brad, for other people than me to say something. So maybe I'll just stop there and see where you want to go next, hopefully with some questions and some reflections from some of the folks in the Zoom.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, the complicity discussion is so important in terms of our role, and you highlighted that in the book. There was a question in the chat box. It said, do you distinguish between war culture and militarism, or are they functionally the same?
That's a great question. I eventually came to draw on the kind of theoretical distinctions about all of this from a wonderful scholar by the name of Catherine Lutz, who's written a lot about this. And she distinguishes between militarism, militarization, and war. So militarism has to do with really the cultural piece, the shaping nature of values and worldviews and assumptions about the military, about war, about violence. That is so important. Militarization has to do with the structural piece, the way then that this same cultural becomes actualized by being materially embedded in the structures and the systems of society. That's militarization. And war culture really, I think, is sort of an umbrella term that maybe stretches over all of it. Because in war culture, really what I'm trying to get at is the way in which culture and structures and the actual activities of war all intermix, all impact and impinge upon one another.
Thank you, Kelly. We have another question here. I'm just trying to read down this. It says, please talk about the apparent difference between persons who demonstrate symptoms of moral injury and persons who have had similar war experiences and do not share those symptoms.
Yeah, that's a great question. Why? And this is actually a question that researchers are really are really working on. People want to know how many returning service members have moral injury. Why doesn't everybody have it? What are the specific kinds of factors and experiences that give rise to moral injury in people's military experience? Researchers identify what they call PMIEs, potentially morally injurious experiences, and they've created lists of them. I'm not sure that anybody really has this completely figured out yet. Different people have very different estimates about how many returning service members are struggling with moral injury. I write about one military psychological researcher who estimated that, in his view, the vast majority of returning veterans struggle with some form of moral injury. Others think that it's much less than that. Why some people and not others? My colleague Chris Antal believes that perhaps it has to do with the extent to which a person really has a reflective conscience. But we might also look at the fact that moral injury doesn't just happen to a person, but it seems that it's something that often develops over time for people, which also makes it very difficult to track. Many veterans have talked about the fact that their moral injury really didn't begin to surface until they returned to the United States and tried to pick up some sort of a life and found that they couldn't, and found that their inability to live with what they had experienced as well as what they had done only grew greater and greater. So military moral injury also isn't new. Even though this terminology was recently developed, researchers have traced it all the way back to the Greeks, and there have been different words for it in every era of war, whether it's shell shock or combat fatigue or other kinds of terminology. It seems to have always accompanied war. So this is why I end up really wanting us to think much harder about what war is and what it does to everyone. And again, I want to come back to this issue of naivete, especially I think on the part of the American public. We, in the post 9/11 period, we have believed, the vast majority, that we could wield unbelievably lethal and widespread instruments of violence and send people out to mete out that violence and simultaneously control it and distance ourselves from it. And that is simply naive. That is absolutely naive. We need to start calling out the architects of violence and demanding that they face its reality, you know. Violence doesn't work like that. It's not a suit of clothing that you can put on and simply take off, even though many of its architects pretend that that's the way that it can be approached. And if moral injury teaches us anything, it teaches us that this view of violence is simply wrong. And people who we say the nation most esteems, its military service members, are being deeply damaged by it.
When I first heard the term moral injury, before I read your book, and I saw the term in the title, I thought, yes, that is what she's talking about, is what all of us as a nation experience from perpetual wars. And it kind of goes to one of the questions in the chat box, which is, do we all experience moral injury as taxpayers, as citizens of this country where so many servicemen are going to war in our name?
I think that it is really important to think about moral injury and moral pain as something that is affecting all of us. But again, the vast majority of people in the United States continue to live, I think, in a fantasy with regard to this. But if we, I remember, you probably all remember with me the Beyond Vietnam speech from Martin Luther King Jr. And there's a line in that speech, if something like, if the soul of the nation becomes totally distorted, part of the explanation will be Vietnam. And I think we do have to, we haven't yet in any real way as a nation begun to face up to, much less own, the poison that is dripped into our national soul as a result of these last 20 years. And again, I really hope, and I would love to encourage and be a part of, I think peace churches might have such an important role to play here, to name that and proclaim that and talk about it with other people. Yeah.
You end your book with this really wonderful thought experiment, this really beautiful and hopeful and practical thought experiment. I thought it would be a good way maybe to end the discussion tonight, if you could just talk about that, how we sort of reconceive ourselves as a nation.
Thank you, Brad. I just have to say, I so appreciate your sensitive reading of my work. That is just the greatest privilege and honor that I could ask for. So thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
Yes, this thought experiment. Actually, I got to live out this thought experiment on the anniversary of 9/11. So in my thought experiment at the end of the book, I'm imagining that one of the ways forward for us would be to really shift the ways that we in the nation tend to commemorate national holidays like 4th of July, Veterans Day, and Memorial Day. So instead of the fireworks, instead of all the flowery speeches, instead of all of the celebrations of violence, instead of sacralizing the military, instead of doing all those things, maybe we could do something different. And in the book, I suggest that one of the ways forward would be to really centralize voices like Andy, to centralize the voices of people struggling with moral injury, as well as to centralize the voices of the refugees and the targets and the victims of war. So I was given the opportunity on the anniversary of 9/11, just last week, to participate with others, a small group of people, in actually doing just that. In Philadelphia, an Iraq war refugee who is an artist, together with an artist who's a part of the Schuylkill Environmental Center, came together to build this traditional Iraqi dwelling structure made of reeds. It's this beautiful structure. If you imagine like a Native American longhouse, it looks sort of like that. And it's sort of a ceremonial structure that goes back 5,000 years in Iraq, used mostly for ceremonial purposes, including resolving conflicts in the community. And so a group of diverse people, including veterans, including war refugees from Iraq, psychologists, chaplains, people like me, regular civilians, religious people, non-religious people, we all came together in this beautiful space, in this gorgeous environmental green space. And the first thing we did was share tea and coffee and cookies. So first there was hospitality. And then we listened to this really amazing soundscape featuring the voices of morally injured veterans and war correspondents. And we listened to this for about a half hour in silence. And then we were led in a guided conversation by a psychotherapist about our reactions to this. And we listened to each other. And it was painful. It was difficult. Some people said things that they had never said publicly before. People probably heard things from others that they had never heard things before. But I have to tell you, I was so grateful to be there. And I found the experience deeply healing. Just deeply healing to listen to all of those different voices. And what really struck me was the similarities. The war veterans were saying things that actually the Iraq war refugees could identify with and similarly felt. It was incredible. It was just incredible. So, there's another suggestion on days such as these to, create artistic, spiritual, hospitality-filled, diverse, and that's really important. Look at this around this circle. I mean, I know that we're here as a part of a particular group, but we need veterans in this group. We need war refugees in this group. We need people of color in this group. We need people of diverse ages in this group, right? And we have to be talking to each other and listening to each other. So I guess that's the word that I would leave you all with just profound thanks for your witness and for your important work. When John brought me to one of your retreats years ago, I remember hearing from Vietnam era aged men who refused the draft, who talked about the significance of counsel from older ministers and religious leaders in their own decision-making about resisting the draft in that era. And that has always stayed with me. And I've just been so appreciative that you are one of those few communities in the United States that has that kind of tradition and that kind of practice. Now, how can we spread that much more widely is the question.
Well, hopefully with your work and the research that you've done and getting this out there, we can do that. And this thought experiment can become a reality. Your research is so important. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, Kelly. We really appreciate it on this International Day of Peace. It's a wonderful discussion. Yeah, a round of applause by all means.
Thank you. Thank you
for your work. And for those of you who have not, or you're not familiar with the book or have not purchased it, I encourage you to do so you can get it and talk to your friends and family about it and help educate folks so we can change this culture. Thank you all for participating. Thanks to the folks at 1040 for Peace for working with us on this. And again, a reminder that there will be a follow-up discussion on this, October 13th at 7 p.m. That link will be on the Facebook page of 1040 for Peace. And we hope to see many of you there to continue the discussion. So thank you all. Have a wonderful night. Take care. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.